here. There you go. So, thank you so much for all of you who just showed up this Sunday to be with us. Happy Sunday to you again. And welcome to African History Club here on Clubhouse. So, we are here often on Sundays at 11 a.m. Eastern Standard Time or 7 p.m. Kenyan time to have a conversation about things of interest or part of the African history that's not well known or would not find in books. And then today we are just privileged and happy to have Dr. Elizabeth Odiambo. If I'm mispronouncing your name, please, you're going to correct me. So here today with us and
Here
just
today with us.
to talk about the history of the Shimoni slave caves in Kenya. So this is her first time joining us on Clubhouse. So I'm going to do a little bit of how am I going to call it now? Like kind of little training where when you are speaking, Dr. Elizabeth, please you see below your screen, you see a mic there. When you're not speaking, just press on there so that you turn it off so that we don't have an echo, right? And then when you're about to speak, you just, press on that to turn it on and you'll be good to go. So I hope it's going to work. So while she's trying to figure that out, I just want to say welcome again. And so one thing that you can do also is that you can follow us on follow the room, right? Follow the club. Over our head, you see the little house there, the green house. Just click on there so that whenever you have events like this, you'll be definitely the first one to be notified. Also, one thing that I want to let you know is that you can also follow us on Twitter at African with K, history number one. And we are recording some of these rooms, so you can find the room also on anchor.fm/. African History Club in one word, but also Spotify, just Google African History Club. Why is important for you to do that? We want you to go there, leave comments, just to make sure that you know what you boost the algorithm, and then more people who may not have access to Clubhouse, who may not be able to be here on Clubhouse today, just for them to be able to go there and listen to the same conversation. So without further ado, if you have friends, people that you follow, you feel like will be benefit from this conversation,
Follow you feel like
please just ping them in. All right. So without further ado, okay, welcome Dr. Elizabeth. And then please do you mind introducing yourself? Dr. Elizabeth, we can hear you. Can you speak close to your can you hear me? Hello? Okay, now you turn off your mic, good. But now can you? Now one thing I want to ask you is that can you introduce yourself now? Go ahead, please. I think she's having issues. Let's be patient, and then she will be back with us in a couple of minutes. Thank you for your patience, please. In the meantime, just kind of little announcements, so just to let you know that hey, if you have friends that you feel like you benefit from this conversation, please invite them. I hope you're going to be patient enough not to leave the room. Thank you, Stephen. Thank you, Matthew. Thank you, Joe, for being here today with us. And hopefully, okay, here we go. All right, Dr. Elizabeth, can you hear us now?
Hello?
All right, hello, we can hear you now. Yeah, go ahead. Please introduce
Yeah,
yourself.
my network appears to be very poor. So good evening, everybody. I'm Elizabeth Odhiambo. I'm a lecturer of literature at Jaramogi Oginga Odinga University of Science and Technology. I love research and I've researched particularly in oral literature. So today's forum comes about because of one of my research studies at Shimoni slave caves in Kenya. Shimoni is actually in Kwale district, about 70 kilometers from Mombasa, for those who have been to Kenya. So it is my pleasure to be with you this evening and have a conversation about the same. Others feel most welcome.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
So now,
So
for
now,
us to follow up, okay, now you can turn off your mic so that we don't receive the echo while I'm speaking. Okay, there you go. Good. Thank you. You're doing so well. So I just want to let the people in the audience know that, hey, if you have friends and somebody who's following you that you feel like will benefit from this conversation, please invite them in. Because one thing that's good about this forums, when this conversation, when we have them, the question is more interactive, right? Than the question people ask beyond what is it that I can ask, and anyone else who has a room and the club can actually ask. So, tell us a little bit more about Shimoni. So, where does the name come from?
So Shimoni is actually a Kiswahili word. It means, in Kiswahili, we talk about shimo. Shimo is a hole. So Shimoni means at the hole. So this name may have been derived from the physical appearance of the place. It is actually a cave that today is approached from the top. So it's like a hole, and as you go in, it's like you're going into a hole. So this hole was actually a slave pen where the slaves were kept for even up to 3 weeks as they waited to be ferried in those to Zanzibar. So the local community is Kiswahili speaking, and I think from the physical feature, they are able to draw that kind of linkage.
Thank you for that, Dr. Elizabeth. So I'm curious now. So who were capturing the slaves, and how did that cave turn into being a place where the slaves were kept? Because we often know when we talk about slavery on the continent, right, in Africa, so we often know about the Gold Coast in Ghana, right? So we often know about Goree. So, but when it comes to uh, uh, Kenya, and then you hear about Shimoni and the slave case, you're like, where does it come? So, who were the people capturing the slaves and keeping them, and where were these slaves coming from? Go ahead.
So the cave is actually natural. It it is made up of coral reefs. It's a hole within the coral reef, but it is said that it was connected with certain underground roots. So these roots were actually dug by the slaves under the supervision of the captors. So the slaves were captured by the Arab merchants that traded in the same, of course, with the aid of African chiefs. So one thing we have to know is that slavery in Africa was not really new. Among certain communities, there were conflicts, there were wars, and during such wars, there were certain war captives. So these captives were often taken away as slaves. And apart from that, among the communities then, even the perpetual debtors were actually sold off as slaves. And so when the Arabs came in, they found that there were certain structures already existing within the African community that could actually assist them. Remember, the communities did not really have prisons for war captives. So having captured them, there wasn't anything much to be done with them except perhaps selling them off as slaves. So the slaves that were kept in Shimoni were captured by Arab slave traders.
All right, thank you. And so when we talk about so what period was that? What kind of century was that? When did this start? And what century was that? Did you hear us? Her network is really poor. So, but Dr. Elizabeth, did you hear my question?
Yes, I did hear your question.
Okay.
So when we look at the history of slave trade in East Africa, it is believed to have started in about the 17th century. It became it may have started in around the 17th century. That is what historians tend to record.
So, meaning that,
So, Melina,
go ahead.
go ahead. Okay, so generally, when you look at slave trade in itself can be traced back to antiquity, but it became a little popular in around the 7th century. We are told that this is the time when Islam was gaining strength in North Africa. And back then, the Muslim Arabs in North and East Africa sold captured slaves to the Middle East. It's about the 7th century. And that the slaves that were captured then were sold to work in fields. Some of them even became teachers. Others were simply harem guards. And that is why when you look at the historical recordings, we find that harem guards were mostly castrated. So the Muslims, ironically Muslims, even the African Muslims, were never taken as slaves because the Islamic views did not allow for this. So within the East African coast, we are being told that okay, certain scholars claim, a scholar like somebody called Ndiaye claims that Muslim Arabs, even in Eastern and Central Europe, used to take white slaves. But then, at some point, the military power within Europe overpowered them, and so they had to turn to Africa. So that is when the focus shifted to Africa, and we are being told here that according to the historians, that in Africa, there used to be conflicts at that particular time. I think talked about the same, where communities used to um and captives during such wars were sold off as slaves. So when the Arab Muslims actually came to Africa, the structures that aided them already existed. Now, on the East African coast, according to historical data, we find that slave trade in East Africa took place from around the 17th century, and more merchants from the Omani Arabs, settled in Zanzibar. So that is why the slaves from East Africa were headed to Zanzibar, because it is in Zanzibar, okay, initially Zanzibar was meant just as a slave market. But then, as demand for other crops like cloves emerged, then the Arabs settled in Zanzibar needed labor. So they shipped slaves to Zanzibar, not to take them to other markets elsewhere, but to employ them within their farms to help in the cultivation of cloves. So it's about 17th century on the East African.
All right, thank you so much. That's really interesting. So, the other question that I have is how, like, when we talk about this where are kept in the Shimoni caves and then actually shipped to Zanzibar. Do we have the specific ethnic group they were coming from, or were they all stolen, taken from all these ethnic groups in Kenya, were they only coming from Kenya? And also the follow-up question I'm having I have for you is that when they moved to Zanzibar, what happened to them? Like, let's say when the Omani slave trader left, what happened to them? Go ahead.
I'm not sure if I got you very well, but I know that the initial captives were headed for the Middle East. So that after capturing them, they were taken by those to Zanzibar, others to the Middle East. But then when the clove trade increased and the Arabs took up this particular kind of farming, Zanzibar now became a place of keeping slaves, not really selling slaves, because they could easily get the slaves from the nearby market.
Oh, great. Thank you. Thank you. So I think you got me right. The other question, that the other part that I asked you was, were they coming from other East African countries, or were they only from Kenya because they were kept in the Shimoni caves?
Now, when you look at the history of slave trade, okay, the ones from the East African coast, we are told that the captors were not able to go so deep inland for fear of diseases. And so they restricted themselves to, not so far from the coast. But when you look at slave trade, even countries like West Africa, countries within West Africa were affected. And the slaves captured from West Africa were shipped to Brazil, to America, and the like. And with now a steady demand for slaves from West Africa, they had to go a little deeper. And even from that direction, they went as far as Central Africa. So from the East African coast, they went as far inland as they could. But remember, the African leaders who saw this as a means of maybe a little income did not hesitate to aid them. So they may have gone deeper into the country. But from recordings, we know that West Africa was affected, Central Africa, and East Africa. So the countries of East Africa were also affected, not just Kenya.
Thank you for that, because that's really interesting. Because when I read it, I was like, okay, because now located in East Africa, I thought to myself, like, okay, maybe only slaves were coming, people who were captured, right, from the Eastern African region were actually brought to kept in the Shimoni's caves. But it's really interesting to notice that, hey, people were coming actually, from different parts of the African continent. So, do we have then? At the beginning of your conversation, you talked about some of there was kind of an underground road that was digged by the people who were captured. So do you mind telling us a bit, breaking down a little bit based on your own research, how the let's say the process was done, like when people were captured, they were kept there. Do we have an idea how long they were kept there, and how long did it take? Because you said that this is actually a natural, Shimon is actually a natural hole, but how were they able to turn that hole into a place where they would keep people, but also take them now to ship them to Zanzibar, and then to the to the Middle East region?
So the hole is actually natural, uh, uh, dug within a coral reef. And it is said that it came as a result of movement of tectonic plates. But then this hole previously was connected to routes that went, underground routes that went as far as 5 kilometers hinterland. And that these routes were dug by the slaves themselves, under the direction of the Arab captors. Now, this hole, maybe as a result of erosion or maybe disuse, the roots have been blocked through siltation. But what remains is the actual hole. And on the walls, the hole, which is actually a cave, it is a group of interconnected caves. So when you are going into that cave, it's like you are going underground. And on the walls, you'd find metal shackles, shackles upon which the slaves used to be tethered so as to avoid escape. And the informants say that these slaves stayed here for up to about 3 weeks. And while in that hole, they suffered starvation. They were fed largely on water and dry food as a way of guarding against the discomfort of maybe they having to ease their bowels within those holes. And the reason why they stayed this long is that they were ferried to Zanzibar on those, and those were they were propelled by the monsoon wind. So they had to wait until the wind took the right direction for for the slaves to be taken to the intended destination. That is why they spent all that time. And truly, it was a moment of suffering because apart from hunger, some were attacked by diseases, some were also injured. And today, when you look at that hole, we are told that the slaves were lowered into that hole using a ladder. Some of them actually got injuries in the process. Remember, the journey from the hinterland was also very long, and they walked chained in single file. And some of them even succumbed to death, and the bodies were left by the wayside because the dead had no use for the captors. So those are some of the reports received in the course of the research.
Thank you so much for sharing that. So now I'm curious. The community living around the Shimoni caves, how do they, what kind of recollection of that history do they have? And also the other question that I have for you is that usually for such a place that is kind of, what you say it was a result of tectonic, kind of collision. So I'm curious because usually in African countries where you have places like that, they usually turn into a place of worship or a spiritual place. So I'm curious, in the course of your research, did you find out that, hey, what, the Shimoni caves before they were used as a place where they would ship slave or keep them there, were they used for some, do they have a spiritual meaning for the community? And what kind of recollection of this trauma actually does the community living around right now have?
So the cave has several uses. It has been transformed to several uses. One, it is used as a shrine. There are those who go to worship there. But we are also told that at some point it provided refuge for the community against cattle rustlers. So they used it as a hideout at that particular point. Remember, we've also said that it was used as a slave pen as they waited to be ferried to Zanzibar. But it has also become a gazetted monument run by the National Museums of Kenya. Now, the research I undertook in Shimoni was to find the interface between history, culture, and orature, because it is believed that a people's history, it is believed that a people's history uh, actually records their way of life. It actually records their way of life. And so I wanted to find out the how or whether the people at Shimoni actually reconstruct this history through their oral narratives. I wanted to find out whether the oral narratives, because the oral narratives should actually reflect a people's philosophical view of the world. So I wanted to find out whether these narratives actually record this traumatizing history of slave trade. And indeed, so that was going to be that was also pegged on this scientific argument by certain scholars that that oral literature has a functional, it has certain functions within the community, that a people's orature always embodies their philosophical worldview, their religious orientation, while at the same time it records the occurrences within history. So this study was actually investigating whether the community around Shimoni reconstructed this traumatic experience of slave trade through the orature. So the objective really was to find out how their philosophy of life is reflected in the narratives. And based on the functionalist theory propounded by a scholar by name Bronislaw Malinowski, who actually argues that a society that cultural activity must have a utilitarian value for its people, or that a society is a functional, is a stable entity that is perpetuated by various cultural activities, and therefore narratives should be seen as embodiments of that belief, of the customs, of the rituals, or even of the structures, and therefore narratives also are charged with a role within the community. So when I went down there, the aim was to collect the narratives and analyze them to see the functions that they actually serve for this particular community. And very interesting revelations came out. For instance, there is this story, they call it Jiwe Jahazi. So this story is about it's about a though that turned into a rock. I got three versions of this particular story. The first one was by, my first informant, a native of Shimoni, says that at one time there was a though traveling from Zanzibar to Kenya. The door was actually laden with the Arab merchants who were coming to look for slaves. Fortunately, as they approached Wasini. Wasini is an island not so far from Shimoni. So as they approached Wasini, they were spotted by certain Arab settlers within Wasini. So these settlers apparently did not like this practice of slave trade. And so they congregated, the Arab elders congregated, and using the Quran, they were able to invoke certain supernatural powers, and that particular though turned into a stone at a place called Mukunguni. So this narrative is told in different versions. Another informant reported that there were similarities in the story. The Arab merchants were approaching, but then they were spotted by African elders. And these elders, in order to save their fellow Africans whom they knew would be taken as captors and would suffer thereafter, they invoked witchcraft, calls it witchcraft. And the result was that though turned into a stone, and the occupants turned into birds, and then they flew away. So when you look at this, we get the people's feelings about slave trade. It is something that was not liked. It is something that they were ready to invoke even supernatural powers so as to do away with. So they believe in the supernatural as offering a solution where man is limited, is seen in both versions of this story. And then the other thing that we learn about this community from this story is that element of maybe collective responsibility. If you like, you may call it communalism, because we see that the Arabs who stopped the first though acted as a team. The same applied to the African the African elders. They came together to cast this spell together so as to stop the occupants of this though in their track. So we see the people coming together as a team to fight this common cause. Then also the element, in both cases, that element of faith, that element of commitment in whatever one is doing also comes out. And we see this in the way these people come together, believing in this supernatural being, believing in the ability of this supernatural to save them from this predicament, and truly they are able to succeed. So we see that element of faith, that element of commitment. But remember, for the Arabs, it is the Quran that is superior. The Africans, who are portrayed as a little superstitious, we see that they invoke witchcraft. So each person or each team plays in their own league. But what is foremost is that through solidarity, they are able to overcome. But we again see that the sympathy of certain individuals towards the sufferers of slave trade is actually exhibited in the Africans, in the Arabs who helped to save, to turn the dough into a stone, and even in the Africans that were able to turn this dough into a stone. Remember, I had said earlier on that the merchants, the slave merchants were actually Arabs. But again, we see that certain Arabs stop the merchants in their track. So it is not everybody in the community that that liked this particular trade. And I'd also said that African leaders, certain African chiefs, aided the merchants in attaining the captors. But in this story, we find that African leaders come together and stop the would-be captors of slaves on their way before they get to Shimoni. So we are seeing that it's not something that was taken up by everybody. That certain individuals actually shunned it, and the fact that they do not want certain individuals to be taken into captive also shows us that they value life. In this community, there is that value of life. And transforming that though into a rock may be construed as a punishment for evil deeds, certain evil deeds, particularly deeds that are disrespectful towards humanity. And it therefore makes us see this community as one that actually acknowledges the sanctity of life, and that those who actually commit evil against their fellows come to no good, as in the case of those merchants that were in the dough. But again, if you go to Shimoni today, you will find that whatever happens there is not actually driven by culture. The community has transformed. They have looked around and realized that they have a resource that could be a means of earning their livelihood. And so they are more, it's more of a tourist spot. People go there to learn about history of slave trade, but at the same time, it's also a source of income from the committee that runs that particular place. So those are some of the things that came out in the course of that research, and we saw that these people are able to relive this history, but there are various versions that have also emerged, and what they do is not necessarily meant to preserve those stories, because if stories also evolve over time. The theme may stay, but then because certain scholars have argued that accounts are sensitive to manipulation based on contemporary concerns and even maybe memory loss, because the generation that is telling the story now did not experience whatever they are talking about, and new concerns have also emerged. But we get certain aspects that expose us to the philosophical view of this community. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Dr. Elizabeth. I think this is extremely powerful, not only to understand that, you know what, the place was a place of refuge, was also used as a cave, like for keeping safe, but also a place of worship. And this kind of three dimensions that the place took is really, really interesting. And so the other part, and I definitely agree with you that, you know what, when it comes to history, evolves, and the stories sometimes are not the like the people who did not live, like you can live the same event and have a different perspective, just depending on the angle where all the perspective you're coming from. So it's going to be time for me now to bring people on stage, people who have questions. So one thing that I want to let you know is that if you have a question, please, you are welcome to raise your hand and come on stage. And I'm trying to bring you on stage and turn your mic. Yeah, thank you for coming on stage. And so before you start asking your question, I just want to give people kind of a little a housekeeping to say, hey, if this is your first time coming to the African History Club, please follow us. And over our head, you see the little house there. Please click on there and follow the club so that when we have events like this, you'll be the first one to be notified. But also, you see the link over our head. That's a sign up. We want to make sure that we keep in touch with you outside of Clubhouse, just in case something happens. We want to make sure that, you know what, we are still in touch with you. And so click on there and just put the email that you would like us to be in touch with you. We want to assure you that, you know what, you're not going to receive multiple emails from us. But again, if you have an event outside of Clubhouse, so we want to make sure that you are notified and you're involved. So also follow us on Twitter at African with K, history number one, so that you are updated on anything that's coming up. We also invite you to follow the recordings of some of the rooms that we have on here on anchor.fm/ African History Club, but also Spotify. Search for African History Club, and please leave your comments, share, so that you boost the algorithm, so our people who are not able to be here on Sunday at this time will be able to actually listen to our conversation as well and learn. So here's the room where I often say that we make history make African sense. So with that being said, thank you, Anne, for coming on stage. Please, if you have a question or comment, go ahead.
Okay, thank you so much for organizing this group. Elizabeth, thank you for your research about Shimoni. I have always been known to say that the slavery in East Africa, especially in Kenya, is rarely talked about, and yet there was a robust slave trade in Kenya and in Tanzania. In Tanzania, we know about it, and uh, the resting place Bagamoyo is a space where it's acknowledged as a spot for slavery. I just wanted to give some comments and also ask some questions. So when I come from Kenya and I come from what was called the Wanga Kingdom, my kingdom was highly implicated in slavery because together with the other kingdoms in Uganda, there would be slavery with the Arabs because the Arabs would go in the hinterland and also capture slaves. Some of the slaves would spend some time in the Wanga kingdom as they headed. This would be slaves from Uganda and even some people who had been captured along the way. So there was a lot of intermarriage with Arabs, and there was a lot of Islam. So apart from the Islam that is at the coast of Kenya, when you look into the hinterland of Kenya, Islam is robustly practiced in Mumias, which is named after one of our kings, and yeah, that's a marker of what had happened then. Um, so I wanted Elizabeth to comment on that. So, yeah, because we never really acknowledge that people were taken from inside Kenya, and even Kenya was a slave route for slaves out of Uganda coming to the coast. Then I also wanted to talk about to find out whether Elizabeth made any connection between the slavery at Bagamoyo and the one in Shimoni when she was doing her studies. Then, lastly, I would like Elizabeth to comment on the town that is in Mombasa. I think it's called Frere Town, where former slaves were returned, and now this is their town. So slaves who were freed live at the coast of Kenya, and they have their own town there, or a place they return. Without Yeah, I think that was my submission for now. I might have to ask questions or add to some points later. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Anne, for those good comments. What you are saying is actually very true. I said that slaves were captured from the hinterland with the support of the African leaders. The merchants did not have to go so deep inside, but the network was there. And with the market of the slaves and the potential income that would arise from it, there was intensity in the search for slaves. But I also wanted to clarify one thing. My research was guided by a specific objective. It was not really historical, it was literary. So the interest was largely on the oral narratives that surround Shimoni and how these oral narratives actually reflect the people's worldview. I'm very sure that if I went to Wanga Kingdom and from those narratives, if I went to Wanga Kingdom, from those narratives, I would be able to get the people's philosophical worldview. I would be able to know the historical experiences that they actually had. Um, Maybe that was what was most limiting in this. It is not really about the sources of the slaves, but it was about what we derive from the stories that exist within those communities that actually capture historical moments within their time. So that was the difference in perspective. Otherwise, what you say, it is true. Slaves were captured from all over East Africa. Frere Town exists, and liberated slaves actually live there. So this is history. This is actually history, the existing fact. So the interest would be in how these people, remember, these are just descendants, they were not the actual victims. My interest would be in how these descendants reconstruct this history of slave trade in their various narratives. Otherwise, thank you very much for that observation.
Thank you, Dr. Elizabeth, for answering. And do you have thank you for your question as well, because that's definitely interesting, and it's pushing me to think about maybe we need to have a conversation about the Arab slave trade, and also because when you talk about those all this kingdom, there's just so much that we have to unpack there. But again, if you were talking to, are you satisfied with the answer? Is that okay?
Yeah, yes, I'm satisfied by what Elizabeth said. There's just one thing I want to add to make clear. Some of the Arabs actually would go into the hinterland. So say in my kingdom, I come from the Wanga kingdom, there are Arabs who settled there, and when we have a museum, you see some of the artifacts they left. Some of them had some families have mixed children from the Arab people, and as you move through my kingdom to say other places in Kenya, you find that they've got descendants. So there are people who call themselves Waswahili, and they even trace their Arab roots to people in Zanzibar or people at the coast. Yeah, and you can see it's because of the Arabs having come in. And if you look at the history of Uganda, you find out that the king was even converted into a Muslim by these Arabs. Our king too was converted into Islam by the Arabs who were involved in this slave trade and other kinds of trades during that time.
Thank you so much, Anne, for that. And that would definitely, I think, if I may ask you, we would definitely need help to learn a little bit more about your Wangi Kingdom, because that I'm becoming a little bit more passionate, right? So, because when you think about, we talk about the history of African kingdoms, we don't know much about the East African part of the continent. It's often, the Western part, and that's where you read a lot of books. So that would definitely be interesting. I would love to learn more about your kingdom. So thank you so much for coming on stage and just sharing sharing your comments or also asking your question. So right now, Anne, another Anne again. So now the second Anne Simpson. Thank you for coming on stage. So please, if you have a comment or question, go ahead.
Thanks, Rebecca. Thank you, Elizabeth. That was very fascinating. I was struck by what you were saying in relation to the conversation that we had a couple of weeks ago on Mzee Ali and his role as a slave trader and then German Ascari. And what you were saying about Islam, etc., ties in a lot with my understanding and the background to Mzee Ali. But what I'm rather interested in about the caves specifically is, do you know if they were used during the First World War by either people trying to get away from being conscripted or, or or even from actual fighting. And I ask this because at some stage in Tanzania, I was approached by a Mzee who was asking about caves on Lake Victoria and their use for carriers who tried to get away from being conscripted by the Germans. And I've never been able to verify that. In your oral history accounts that you've encountered, did you come across anything like that, please?
So thank you for that question. The committee that manages Shimoni has a write-up about this experience, but they do not capture the world wars. But what comes out is that it was a hiding spot for the community against enemies, against cattle rustlers. It became a shrine. It was a slave pen. So that is what they capture. So, well, it's not stated overtly, but the World War does not feature. I would need to investigate further.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And I think that also ties in with what other Anne was saying earlier about Mumias as well, if I've pronounced it correctly, because that features quite a lot in the carrier story too. So I think there's a lot of links that can hopefully one day be pulled together. Thank you very much for interesting info.
Thank you so much, Anne, for coming on stage and asking your questions. So I just want to keep us going and just to kind of, set the room here and say here again, a welcome to you all in the audience who came in the room this Sunday. Here's the African History Club. So please, if you want to follow the club, please follow the club. Right over our head there, you see the Clean House. Click on there and follow the club. And also follow us on Twitter, African with K. History and number one. I often say that here is the room where we make history make African sense, right? So, and today we are discussing the history of the Shimoni slave caves in Kenya. It's really interesting that, and as kind of a literature kind of person, tap into this history because she was interested in the oral history of this. So, while we are waiting for people to come on stage and ask the questions, and I was curious when you actually talked about how the place was not only a place of worship, was a place of worship, was a place for people where slaves were kept, was also a place where people were hiding, like kind of a refuge for the community. Do we have can we sequence it in time? Is it right for me to assume that, before it became a place where slaves were kept, was actually maybe a place of worship, but also it was was maybe a place of worship, but also a place at the same simultaneously a place where people were hiding from, cattle raiders.
It might be difficult to establish the timelines, but with the end of slave trade, the cave was vacant, and so it was given some use. Remember, the slave trade took place a long time ago, and that is why today you may not find the routes. They have been blocked through siltation, which means that even if these caves were approached using these routes, then it must be several years back. But what is happening now? Of course, they may not hide there from cattle rustlers as it is. What is happening now is that it is viewed as a shrine, and it is a tourist spot that is rich in the history of slave trade. The castle, the hideout, the use of the slave cave as a hideout from rustlers must have taken place way back at the point when these routes still existed. It's not now. So the use may have changed over time. The timelines are not recorded, and so I would view that as a gap that could still be investigated so that it's pegged to specific periods of time.
Thank you so much for that clarification. So, and maybe the other question that I wanted to ask you, because when Anne, the other Anne, came on stage and she talked about her own kingdom, I think the one kingdom, do we know to what kingdom does this Shimoni cave, like who did they belong to? And actually, were they kings over that part of the coast of Kenya?
Maybe I can answer that about the kingdoms that I know about. Most of the kingdoms in East Africa, and there are 8 of them, they're around Lake Victoria. So in Kenya, there was only one kingdom, the Wanga Kingdom. Then there's some other kingdoms in Buganda. They've got some in Rwanda and some in Tanzania. But the other parts of Kenya did not have kingdoms. They had all these. They had leaders. They had all these great leaders. So at the coast, there was no kingdom.
Thank you, Anne, for that. Elizabeth, I saw you. You wanted to say something.
No, Anna's filled the gap very well. So I don't need to say anymore.
Okay, thank you so much. Thank you so much for that. It's really interesting to see how different parts of Africa were actually, at the leadership or the ruling was extremely different. So it's really interesting. So I want to welcome everybody in the room. Again, over our head here, you see the sign the join. Please click on there because we want to make sure that we keep in touch with you. If in case we have events that we are planning to organize right outside the clubhouse, so we would just want to make sure that you'll be in touch. We will be in touch with you, and then you'll be aware of that. But also, I just want to reassure you that you're going to receive many emails from us. Except we have an event, that's when you're gonna receive an email from us. So if you have a question, people in the audience, please, if you have a question or comment, please come ahead and come on stage, raise your hand, and then we will welcome you on stage, and then you ask your question. So now, in the meantime, I was just curious. So, what other facts is that you find in your research and that you feel not and I'm so sorry. Now you see and Elizabeth, Dr. Elizabeth, that you feel like you was really mind blowing for you, and that you feel like it's really important for us to know, and then people who may not have access to your article will be able, you should know, and maybe need further research. Dr. Elizabeth, did you hear me? It was actually to you, not to Anne. The question was addressed to you.
Anna, maybe I didn't get your question so well.
So yeah, thank you so much. So I was just curious about what What is it that you found in your research that you feel like was really mind blowing, and that you feel like is really important for people to know and maybe needs further research?
Okay, this research was centered on finding out how people actually connect with the past through their practices. So, for a literary scholar, I think this is something very important because culture is dynamic, society has changed, and there is always the issue of identity. It would be interesting to find out how the individual's identity is reflected in the individual's identity is reflected in the narratives, is reflected in the actions, it is reflected actually in the way of life, because it actually defines the individual. And this time I would not really look at it from the functionalist perspective. I would maybe go psychoanalytic, in the sense that sometimes the past informs quite a lot in what an individual does. So it would be interesting to go down to communities and just find out something about their maybe psychological makeup, the psychoanalytic perspective, as embedded maybe in their actions. It may not be conscious, but sometimes you see it is very difficult to run away from this past, even with the dynamism. There are always traces that remain behind. So maybe that's for the literary artist. The historian, of course, will go for the facts. Thank you.
Thank you so much for sharing that. And one thing that I also find extremely interesting is that you talked about the place now being used as a shrine. So does it mean that they have a priest there who seated there? Can you maybe describe what is happening right now when it comes to shrine beside it being used like a tourist area?
Somebody once said that Africans are very religious. It is true. And this happens maybe because from their recognition of the existence of certain supernatural powers, certain supernatural beings that are able to intervene when man is at his lowest. So those caves are also used as shrines by religious groups that just go there to congregate, maybe because of the peace, the serene environment that lies within there, and they see those as spots where they can easily connect with their maker, connect with the supernatural, maybe find peace in their hearts. So it may have come naturally because of maybe failure to, it's sort of mysterious, there appears to be some mystery in the caves themselves, from the makeup, and even from the traumatizing experience, and even the fact that that experience actually came to an end. It's also a sign of liberation from a kind of past that nobody would want to identify with anymore. Maybe that is why this has actually turned into a shrine, in recognition of the supernatural, or maybe uh, supernatural intervention that was able to liberate the people at the time.
Okay, thank you so much for that. And so just to clarify a little bit, so it has turned into a shrine. It's just that people are going there to worship or to pray. It's not that there is a priest there who's kind of ministering to the people, right?
No, there's no priest. It's personal communion with God.
Thank you so much. And I saw you wanted to share something with us. And the other and yeah.
Yes, yeah, thank you so much. Elizabeth, again, thank you for your deep research. I'd like to invite you to my kingdom. I would connect you to my dad uh, for you to interview him and the elders, the Council of Elders and the reigning king about slavery. I tried to talk to our king about it, and he was a little bit in denial about it, so you might not be able to retrieve much from him. But I feel like it's important that these elders in my communities are interviewed and the data that you collect is shared with others, because most of them, this is, my dad is among the oldest members of my, there are other older members in other clans, and I feel like if this is not done, if this library that we have is not documented, they might die, and we might miss out on the information that they have around slavery. So I would like to back channel you and connect with you. Even my namesake Ern, if you're interested, I'd like to connect with both of you as your historians interested in slavery, so that you can find time and resources to go into Western Kenya and talk to these elders. Then, secondly, I'd like to share a song that was sung by Roger Whittaker. Roger Whittaker is a Kenyan. We have some British people who are Kenyan citizens, so he's a Kenyan Briton, and he sang country music. So I think when in the 80s or 90s, this song would play on the radio a lot, and it is in the psyche of many Kenyans. He would sing about Shimoni as this painful place. Yeah, so he's invoking what went on in Shimoni, and that's the first time I remember hearing about Shimoni. And we talk about it with my friends. I went to boarding school, and we had some friends from the coast of Kenya, and they tell us a little bit about that. So I'm just raising this to note that songs can also be a space of historicizing events, and that even in societies like ours, where slavery is highly denied and we don't talk about it, we in our psyche we know about this. Yeah, so if you grew up in the 80s or 90s in Kenya, you know of Roger Whittaker and the song Shimoni. I have sent Rebecca a link to that song with the lyrics, so yeah, it's shared up there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Anne,
So,
for go ahead. Go ahead, Elizabeth.
okay, I just want to thank Anne very much. I would be very willing to connect with you so that I further this research. I
Thank you so much, and for just coming to the room and sharing all of that, because I'm definitely curious. I am going to follow you, ladies. Just make sure that you know what this this project is on, and I think I had a guest here sometime this year who was talking about you know what the lived experience of, and if you go actually, and I would definitely encourage you guys to go into on anchor.fm/African History Club and look for the podcast talking about the live experience of slavery of Africans, and you will see, when she talked about how the trauma, right? So of the people in the western of Ghana, how even within the songs you actually um understand that kind of with the trauma that they experience, right? So how they would sing like some of the songs that I would sing for example for people who have died during the funerals, they will always sing song to say, hey, for you guys, she provided translation to say, okay, for you guys who have died in the seas, like she was like, that's how they could collect, but also it's kind of it was such a traumatic experience, so that they still live it, and it was fascinating to me because I told her that you know whenever we hear about slavery and then the trauma of slavery, we often hear about it, let's say in the U.S. and sometimes in the know what in the Caribbeans, right? So, but when it comes to Africans themselves, is where you rarely hear about that kind of traumatic experience. So, my guess is that when you hear about your elders in your community not even being willing to talk about it, for the understanding we have of psychology now and a trauma. My guess would be that it's such a traumatic experience that they don't want to relive that trauma. But that would definitely be interesting. And yes, I'm happy that Elizabeth said yes. So it would be really interesting to hear more about that, but also to find historians, right, who have been working on the Wangi Kingdom, and just to you said what Wangi Kingdom, so just kind of relive and write about that history. And I'm now to you, and I'm just curious now, the other and not and Samson. So the other and I'm wondering, are there historians who are writing history, like the history of your kingdom, that you know of? Is there something that is really being researched?
Yeah, there's some historians who've written about the kingdom. Uh, there's also a whole booklet from an author out of Canada. So if you go onto Google, you'll find information about the kingdom, and you'll find various authors who've written about the kingdom. Because the kingdom was very important in the colonization too. When the missionaries came, they also lodged there before they headed for Uganda. Because at first the British were not even interested in Kenya. They were interested in finding out the source of River Nile. So they were headed to Uganda. Then they stopped in the Wanga Kingdom on their way there. So there's stories about the kingdom, or the history of the kingdom is very well documented. Yeah. There's other scholars who do research on. I've read work from a linguist who studies a linguist with anthropologist who studies the way Swahili was able to take root in the Wanga kingdom, because the king used that language to conquer other people around, and it was the language of administration. So apart from the Swahili that is spoken at the coast of Kenya, sometimes some of my people take pride in saying, "Oh, this is the second coast of Kenya. This is Mombasa too," because we speak this very formal Swahili. We are the Swahili speakers of the hinterland, and they connect, and they also have relatives who live at the coast. So this there's been a lot of research that people do around the Wanga Kingdom, and there's a time that the kingdoms had become very powerful again all over Africa with the help from Muammar Gaddafi. He was bringing together all these powerful chiefs and kings in Africa and funding them before he died. So at that time too, our king was very close to Muammar Gaddafi. Yeah. So then there's that documentation too.
Thank you so much. That's definitely extremely interesting. Yeah, we're definitely going to look into that, and that will be that's definitely awesome, because I'm actually on Google now and finding a lot, right, about the kingdom. It's amazing. So I don't know if anyone else in the audience or in the room has another question or comment before we close this room. I do want to be respectful that in Kenya now, I think it's 8 p.m., right? So past 8 p.m. So I just want to make sure that allow Dr. Elizabeth to have time to to be with her family, but also do the rest. All right. So, Dr. Elizabeth, do you have any final words or concluding remark?
So I just want to pass my appreciation to you as the host and to the rest of the audience. I think it has been a very good session for me. It is also eye-opening, and I'm coming from this platform with a wider view. Anne has brought in a very good perspective, and I think that there is still a lot more that can still be done in regards to slave trade, even just beyond looking at the narratives. The narratives are important because they tell the story. They too tell the story, and I'm very happy that you're able to mention Roger Whittaker's song. I actually cited it in my publication, though it was not it wasn't entirely my interest. And truly, narratives tell a lot about a people's oral history. I would want to further this research. I think it should go beyond just Shimoni, and I hope that even at a later date, when the other research is finally done, we will be able to share. Otherwise, thank you very much. I think this is the first time I'm coming on this platform, and I'm very happy that it actually worked. So thank you so much, Rebecca, for granting me the opportunity. I hope we'll still maintain the connection. In Kenya now we are saying good night, but I know for you maybe it's midday. So have a nice time.
Thank you so much, Dr. Elizabeth, for just coming on stage. Thank you, Anne. Thank you, the other Anne. Thank you to everyone who came into the room. And thank you so much. I just want to encourage you to follow African History Club. Follow us on Twitter at African with K, History number 1, so that you inform on any other event. But also make sure that you go on anchor.fm/ African History Club so that you can leave your comment there. Also, share the podcast. Make sure that more people are informed about the work that we're doing here. You can also go on Spotify and type in search in the podcast, the search box, African History Club. Please go on there, leave your comment and share, and build the algorithm so that it can help us reach more, even more people who are not able to be here with us sometime on Sunday. So for those of you who are here, I just want to wish you a happy rest of the week, beginning of the week. Good night, good evening, and good afternoon for those of you who are in the US and elsewhere. And also just to make sure that if we do not, this is the end of the year. We are running toward the end of the year. It has been a tough year for everyone, but I feel like there has been some good things, and for all for you and your family. If I don't see you in the upcoming home, I just want to wish you a happy, 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 happy rest of the year. Please be safe, and also a happy new year in advance. I wish you all the best. So for Anne and everyone else, we're going to and Dr. Lisa, we're definitely going to continue the conversation offline. So again, thank you and happy rest of the day. Bye bye for now.
Bye bye.
Bye.